Well, welcome everybody and welcome to Process Online. This is our second online event, but our first on Zoom. We'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which Liv and I are broadcasting to you today, the Wurundjeri and Burrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We also extend our acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the lands on which our guests and audience themselves are from and are contacting us from tonight. We encourage everyone to take the time to learn about the traditional owners of the lands on which they reside, work and seek nourishment from in these uncertain and difficult times. Lastly, we acknowledge that the people of this land maintain knowledge through an oral tradition practiced for generations. It is in this oral format that we are so excited to bring you this month's event. My name is Sarah Mayer and this is Olivia Potter. We are both really excited to be here online on a platform that allows us to transcend newly apparent boundaries, the likes of postcodes, state borders and buildings being some of the most obvious of late. We're excited by the opportunity Zoom presents to create process at Luke Bar and that robust discussion and debate that are possible in our informal and social setting that we usually get here. So hopefully we can create that online. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Liv to introduce the theme for the night and each of our speakers, but I'd like to first thank Luke, who have just pulled out all of the stops to support us and get online. So we're immensely grateful that they've kind of pushed us online, and that's been fantastic. So over to you, Liv.
So the theme of tonight is called What Is Now is Inadmissible, and it talks about what it means to build and work on sovereign land. You may have read this already in the event bio, but I'll read it again just to put us all on the same page, and because it'll be the theme which the speakers will talk to. The architectural industry works on stolen Indigenous land. It builds on ground that was never ceded. Architecture excavates this dirt. It plugs in foundations. It sculpts iron ore into steel that defines our skylines. It markets light colour palettes as fresh and clean. It profits from and gives profits to those who have already been the biggest beneficiaries of colonialisation. And in most cases, it obscures, replaces and destroys connection to Indigenous culture. In our education and practice, amidst the ubiquity of clean white models, the implicit whiteness of modernity, the white treasures of antiquity, when were we encouraged to think about this critically? In the wake of increased awareness and knowledge that racism is systemic, we need to learn to refuse things as they are now, and our words need action. The architectural world needs a good toppling. We need to redress how we interact with the land, air and water. What is now is inadmissible. How can we become architectural accomplices for an Indigenous future? What does it mean to work on sovereign land? So we're going to do this discussion by each of our speakers, and we've got 4 great speakers. They're each going to give a 5 to 10 minute introduction about them and their work, and then there'll be time to answer and ask questions. So on the chat in the side, you are most welcome to pose a question at any point during the discussion, and yeah, then we'll call out, Sarah and I will pick our favourites, or and then we'll get our speakers to talk to each of those. Our first speaker is Jenny Lee. She's a landscape architect, interior designer and pastoralist, and is a professor of landscape architecture at the University of Melbourne. She's also an adjunct professor in interior design at RMIT University. Her academic research and teaching focuses on cultural and critical landscape architecture and spatial interior design theory and studio practice. She works with engaging curation and post-production of complex landscapes. She's a registered landscape architect and is involved in the strategic planning, design and practice of urban and educational landscapes in Melbourne and beyond. And before we go on, I'm just going to tell you who our other speakers are. So we've also got Kim Bridgeland, who is a director of Edition Office, who many of you will know through his work that's currently at the NGV, the In Absence Pavilion. We've also got Sophia Pearce, who is a Bakanji woman from far western New South Wales, And then finally, we've got Jock Gilbert, who is a landscape academic at RMIT University. Thanks, Jeannie. You are welcome to start speaking now.
Oh, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm speaking to you tonight from Adnyamatna country in the Flinders Ranges, the most beautiful place in the world. And I would like to acknowledge that everybody who I know, and they're from here, and elders past and present and emerging. It's a real privilege to be able to head out of the city and work in Aboriginal country over the years. As I said, I'm in Adnyamatna country in the Flinders Ranges, and I happily continue to work with elders here on a project about common plants and building a bush garden. Of past times, I've contributed to projects in the APY lands of South Australia around making a project for single men's housing in Wimley, and prior to that, an art centre at Patar in the Gibson Desert, and also town and coastal planning up in the Torres Strait. So you can see I've been really lucky to work in many, many different countries with many people. But today I'm going to speak less of formal projects that lead on to on-the-ground constructions and more about research in arid places around water systems and water holes. And that's led to the Water Law project, which some of you might know about, for rivers and places, particularly the Kunara Cooper Creek to Kaditunda Lake Eyre in South Australia, and the Murrundi, Milawa, Murray and Barker Darling rivers that flow through South Australia and New South Wales and Victoria. The main idea behind the work is looking at water culture and the right to access water in the landscape beyond a commercial resource. The one thing I will ask you to notice, and I'm trying to do this all the way through and it's an ongoing project, is to notice the importance of naming and having Aboriginal names alongside the post-invasion names that are usually found on everyday maps. And one of my projects is to try and name the places that we look at in both names where at all possible, and actually the Murray is known by up to 10 names as it flows from hills to sea, from Dungala to Mille to Milawa to Murrundi, and I know I've missed some names. So that's just a basic who I am. But I thought to open up the conversation, I would sort of share a couple of stories that I've collected over time to focus possibly on the question of ways of working within the system that may cause a disruption, which is one of the questions we've been asked, but rather to enable a greater understanding of country and what happens in it. So I'm now going to try and do one of those things which is called share screen. And just a second, whoops. Okay, so these are three stories. I'm showing you the beautiful Hookie's waterhole at Udnadada. And this is about the story of the Fish Day. I was working on the cultural use and history of remote waterholes with Dale McNeil, who's an aquatic ecologist, working with fish research in a multidisciplinary scientific project on critical refusal, which is if these waterholes dry up, everything dries, for the South Australian government. The project funding did not provide for good consultation with the Yarrabunna people at Udnadada, but in conversations with the school when we were there doing our basic research, Dale and I devised a project to hold a fish day for the school kids during their school holidays and after our project ended. We made some fish posters for the school and travelled up from Adelaide to spend the day learning about how these fisher people harvested their waterholes. We both talked about how the waterhole was being loved to death through overuse. And we also saw how the banks were resulting with turbidity of the water and the sickness of the fish. But you can also see from these images that it's a swimming hole and everything happens in here. This is our fish day. We also saw the pile of stones at the entry to the waterhole, which you can see in the bottom left, realising they'd been carefully placed as fish traps, something that could be easily be thoughtlessly destroyed during road widening unless you knew what you were looking at. Apart from fishing and swimming, we gave the kids some drawing materials and for them to draw their waterhole and its fish. followed by a delicious meal of the yellowbelly caught by the kids and the women. From this we realised that Hookies is a woman's place, and this is why women and young children came that day. The locals came away with new interest in how they might look after the riverbanks and how they might think on another project for Aljabuckina Waterhole further down the road, a men's waterhole, and they wanted to do that for the young men and elders so they could also learn about ways of caring for their waterhole. And this is not to say they didn't know how to care for their waterhole, but they was just loved it so much that you could start to see how it might not survive. The next project, the second project, is about how to understand the river through travelling the waterholes and the symbolism of the stick. So later on, another South Australian Arid Lands government project that did provide for funding for travelling Dieri and Yandrawanda and Yarrawaka people of the Kunari Cooper Creek meant that we ended up near the choke near Inaminka. It also meant walking along the creek with Dieri man Willie Dawson, a keen fisherman. We'd been doing our landscape mapping along the creek and looking at a series of popular campsites at waterholes. I wanted to ask Willie how he understood how the waterways worked from First Peoples perspectives in terms of what he was willing to share. He reached down and picked up a stick from the ground on the river bank. "This is the Cooper," he said. He gave it to me to keep. And it's really hard to see, but each nub on this small stick to him presented the location of each waterhole and a way of travelling along the creek. And when you look at it, there are 7 waterholes and there are 7 nubs on this stick. I still have and care for this stick, and it reminds me of how we can share talking and being in place, and the place of stories and tools to enrich our understanding. He also reminds me that my spelling of Kunari isn't his spelling of Kunari, although it's in the official record, and that each people has their own name and language for places, and names are complex and open to multiple interpretations. My third story is how people are performing and talking, sharing the river through music and art, especially, and this particular one is on the Barker Darling. Our water law project kind of draws out of these earlier projects of looking at waterholes and looking at water places. And it's about dry land water research. We had an exhibition in April and May in 2019, and it's predominantly an exhibition of maps and words for water to try and start with some conversations. However, we also set about looking for expressions of water knowledge through art, music and film as time-based productions. And now I'm hoping to share one small snapshot of the many, many works made by people along the rivers of the Murray-Darling system. For me, these resonate so potently in the way that we can share and gain knowledge of what is important, what is of concern, and what might be ways to think of how our knowledge, skills and tools might be useful and not get in the way. So now I am going to try, and we didn't try this one, so I'm going to see if this is going to work. I just want to share this a little bit if I've got a bit of time, because it's fantastic. It's quite an old one. Here we are. And I don't know if you can hear it, but oops. That's as high as we'll go.
Video. Ini phone video on.
So I just thought I'd stop sharing that there, because one of the things that I actually found about finding so many videos and so many ways of starting to express and communicate how you might play these water places and how you might sing and dance them, they've just resonated in terms of how we might sort of start to think about the creative aspects of what we're doing. So that's probably what I wanted to just offer.
Thanks, Ginny. That's been great. I think unfortunately we didn't see the video, but I've just written a message.
Oh, didn't share?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's we could hear it. We could hear it. But we might get you to send that to us privately, and then we can share that on our Instagram.
Okay.
Yeah. But
well, just to show you, it was a whole pack of wonderful little boys rapping the river. So I'm not sure why that wouldn't have worked. Anyway, we should have tried it before.
The audio, so I think the musical component was definitely present. Thanks, Ginny.
Yeah, thanks, Ginny. I liked that kind of oral tradition is so important in Indigenous culture, and you use that as a method to share with us as well. And I like your point about unless you know what you're looking for, you don't know, which kind of points to the importance of education. I'm going to now introduce our second speaker, Kim Bridgeland. Kim is a founding director at the award-winning architecture studio Edition Office. He's also a practicing artist who has worked both nationally and internationally. He gained a Master of Architecture at RMIT with a distinction and a Bachelor of Architecture at the University of Newcastle. His parallel practice as an artist strongly informs his thoughts on architecture. This influence comes from an exposure to rich and diverse ways of thinking and writing about complex cultural and aesthetic concerns, as well as from his own sculptural practice that allows an intimate and creative level of material expression. This experience within the arts adds a deep richness to his thinking and methodology towards both architectural practice and the public conversations that surround it. Thanks, Kim.
Thanks, Liv. I think you must have got that bio must have found its way from some EOI submission. It sounded awfully formal.
I was also going to say everybody should check out Edition Office's website because it's beautiful. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, everybody. I'm just going to 2 seconds. Can you all see my presentation? Hopefully that's working. Now, when we formed our studio, Edition Office, it was within the understanding that we were working from within the context of this nation's colonial legacy. This nation was formed within the frame. Oh, hang on. Someone's letting me know. Yes, you can see it. Thanks, Aaron. This nation was formed within the framework of great deceit and with great trauma to its Indigenous inhabitants. And to allow this to happen, a narrative had to be constructed within the collective mind of those advancing the colonial project, that the original occupants of this land were not sufficiently worthy. In fact, they were less than human, and that they had no rights to the land that they had been caretakers of for over 3,000 years. These lands shown in map of countries by Sarah Lynn Rees on the screen here. The underlying premise of this false narrative still exists today and continues to devalue the lives of First Nations people. We're at the point in our history where previously the memory of this trauma has been removed from the story of this nation that we try to tell ourselves. And by removing that memory of systematic dispossession of land, life and culture, we have a society with a profoundly unbalanced playing field where the injustices of the last 230 years are hardwired into our economic, educational, judicial and incarceration systems. Our distorted national mythology perpetuates this as it continues to center the lived experience, the gaze of the non-Indigenous worldview that continues to petition the Indigenous gaze and their lived experience as other, as a fringe issue. As architects, whether we understand it or not, we play a significant role in the narrative formation of this country. There is an immense range of cultural and historical narratives embedded within the built environment and within the sites that we seek to build upon as architects. But our architectural heritage and the monuments that we celebrate within it almost exclusively reinforces and legitimizes the stories of colonial settlement and of its European heritage. As our towns and cities are the backdrop to where we live and grow up, we genuinely accept these stories without questioning who or what they represent, because they are there. They attain legitimacy, and importantly, what has been forgotten or ignored does not. Architecture has an extremely important role, not only in sensitively responding to the needs of the communities that it serves, but in giving presence to marginalized voices and their lived experience within our collective story. And with that presence, with the centering of the Indigenous gaze, comes greater authority to have a stronger level of political self-determination. This image in front of us is a work by a friend of ours, a collaborator, Daniel Boyd, Gangala and Gujula man. It's a depiction of the memorial to Captain Cook. This work here is the depiction from him of the same body of work of the moment, I guess the death of Captain Cook is its title. His work splinters the gaze, I guess splinters our historical gaze, and understands or reinforces the position that there's a multitude of perspectives based on our different backgrounds and how we understand and how we bring forward our history and what its implications are. We have a great privilege of working with Dan on For Our Country, the first national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander War Memorial. I guess the center line, or I guess the facilitator, the thing you engage with this work, is a 10-meter wide, 3-meter high, two-way mirror glass screen, which positions yourself as the audience and the viewer, and the environment that you're in on the other side of this point cloud veil. And so you're seeing yourself as other, you're witnessing yourself in relationship to, I don't know, alternate times, alternate contexts. And gives this, I don't know, empathetic possibility of seeing the other and contemplating in Indigenous gaze. In this photograph, the dawn light coming over Mount Ainslie and across the dome of the Hall of War Memorial is reflected and transformed, I guess transfigured outside of a colonial gaze or my gaze. And splintered into 1,000 multitudinal different ways of seeing it. The foreground, this basalt rock field, it wasn't commissioned as such, but it was incredibly important to Dan and ourselves to make this war memorial reflective of the formal armed services, or the Australian armed services, as well as representative of Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have fought to and sacrificed for their own country during I guess the frontier wars, the resistance wars of the colonial period. The basalt stone is something that's been used for thousands of generations as a weapon, as a tool and a weapon of war. The work is positioned so as to look back at the landscape on Ngunnawal and Gambia country, native pigmented rammed earth, and creating, oh no, I don't have a whole lot of time, so I'm moving quickly, and creating a space internally. So there's a collective space of gathering outside, and there's a more internal, solitary, introspective space on the inside of the war memorial, which the dawn light, the first light of every day, shines through the two-way mirror glass screen, allowing a view back to the landscape that you were once within. But also taking this small interior chamber and bathing it in this point cloud light. In the center of that basalt stone field is a cast bronze mouth to an earth vessel that goes 4 meters underground. And this is for ceremony, it's opened and revealed, which is how we see it now. Otherwise it's sealed, sealed and protected, but this is a vessel where elders from every single Aboriginal country and Torres Strait Island country are invited to come here and bring earth from their country and deposit it in this earth receptacle, which is the center of the war memorial. We're also incredibly fortunate to work with the extraordinary Uaniskirth, Nukunui Gugava woman, on In Absence, our 2019 NGV Architecture Commission, which is just recently reopened again with the NGV just last weekend until September. The purpose of this project was to bring forward less remembered or memories and histories and stories, Indigenous stories that were that have been excluded, that weren't centered within our understanding of this country. And then in fact, we're in contradiction to, I guess, that false premise of terra nullius, which forms the backbone of this state and the psyche of it. The building as a physical form, as an external manifestation, its point and purpose is to give presence to history that, you know, we're not meant to, you know, we cannot look away from any further. It's something that cannot be ignored based on its scale, its volume and its bulk. And the void essentially, I guess, speaks to that, that false absence, that declaration of a false absence of a people. Internally though, it's quite a different space. It removes, I guess, that city context that the NGV inhabits, and it creates a removed space surrounded by this, I guess, the scent on one side of you know, layered campfires, and on the other side, the scent of fresh eucalypt leaves, and adorned with 1600 handmade, hand-blown black glass yams, which are a dominant part of Ioani's practice. And the yams speak of the agricultural practice, but also the bodies, the narratives, the histories that have been lost, but are resiliently, you know, moving forward in this country despite all that's happened. And the purpose, I guess, is mirrored dual chamber inside. Its purpose is to bring forward these histories of permanent settlement, permanent houses, of agricultural, of engineering, of Indigenous memory and knowledge, and bring them forward and create a space of discourse, a space for, you know, for deep listening and conversation from across that divide of Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia, to recenter those stories and enable a platform of communication and conversation, as well as a focus onto the, I guess, the immediate present, and in the context of the work, that immediate present is the sky and the clouds. So the here and now, watching the sun and the path of the sun, and the movements of the weather pass above, and reframing in intimacy with the country we're in one small format. So it's a, you know, a wonderful privilege and honor to work on these projects. And as an architect, as architects at Edition Office, we certainly see it as a role. It's a privilege we have to be in this position, and it's certainly a role that we see as incredibly important to work with, and to, you know, to get to know, but to provide a platform where possible for Indigenous stories to overcome, I guess, 230 years of their elimination. That's my introduction. I hope I haven't taken up too much time.
Thank you, Kim, very much for that introduction to your work. And I just want to say, I mean, everything that you've said obviously is really relevant to this conversation, but really in particular is how we see ourselves in this context of, you know, Indigenous history, and how your architecture really frames that, because you're right, as in absence, it is, it gives it a presence and it can't be ignored. It is, yeah. So next up, I have the pleasure of introducing two speakers who are joining us together from the Murray River, Sophia Pearce and Jock Gilbert. Sophia Pearce is a Barkindji woman from far western New South Wales, currently completing a PhD in anthropology through La Trobe University. Sophia is a board member of the Culpa Milli Aboriginal Corporation. Hi, Sophia. And a principal of the Culpa Madita Consultation Group. Sophia's interests lie in preserving and protecting culture and heritage, particularly around management and repatriation of Barkindji cultural objects and places. Sophia has won national research awards for her work, which has been exhibited nationally and published both nationally and internationally. I'm also going to introduce Jock at the same time, and I'm a little bit unsure if they're going to be speaking one after another or perhaps bouncing back off one another. Jock Gilbert is a non-Indigenous landscape architect, academic and program manager of the Bachelor of Landscape Architecture and Design degree at RMIT University. His research interests lie in community engagement, regenerative practice and Indigenous-led design research, focused around the development of green infrastructure through the convergence of concepts of place, country and landscape. Jock's work has won national research awards and has been exhibited nationally and published internationally. He's a regular participant in national issues through public presentations and interviews, and both Sophia and Jock join us here in a very similar capacity tonight, and I'll hand it over to you to decide how you run your talk. Thank you.
I'll go first. One, Nai, Wimpicha, Wutta, Pumako, Nunga, Mali. I'm saying hello to you in my Barkindji language as men, women, old women, young women, just in acknowledgement of my language group and where I come from. I've kind of, apart from that beautiful spiel, and bio's the only one that kind of gets me on the agenda, I think, but I'm all about storytelling in terms of Indigenous knowledge and my orality to that. I'm an anthropologist. Well, I'm in my third year of an anthropology PhD. I have a master's in social policy and planning, but my passion is about working with my people. I recently sort of put in a bid to do the review of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan as a part of Culpa Marta is about talking up big to government agencies. So it's coming from my language group in representation that through me, on country, through my people, was sharing knowledge about water and what we see as a value as a part of our water rights. So Jock and I invited Jock along to come along, and because he'd already been working with Aboriginal people and along the Barker and the Murray. So I live on country. I've grown up on country. I still live on country. I live on my father's country, which is on the other side. I'm a muddy woman through my father's line connected to the Latchi as well. I guess I just really wanted to yarn about what projects we've worked on, and maybe it's not as clear, but it's certainly something that I've worked upon, is transforming the students that come out to RMIT, from RMIT, Aboriginal people who may not have been in such a professional relationship or having a partnership with institutions such as RMIT, or seeing Culpa Marta separate to the institution that had done some groundwork previous to that. So the relationships were already built into the work that we'd been doing along the Murray-Darling right up to Burke. So, Auntie, I seen you mentioning my people. You know, that you were talking about those kids from the Bark. I'm probably related to them. Probably know that mob. And we certainly looked at cultural values by the stories that Aboriginal people told us about the rainbow serpent that made the Great Lakes and how that happened. So it was really nice to hear those stories. Some of it is about connection to places that are vital to our survival as Aboriginal people. So I think that letting Aboriginal people lead in the culture, or I guess the community, or the type of work that you've been doing, I think if you're going to work in partnership with Aboriginal people, it's about building partnerships, and it's not about, you know, your knowledge is greater than mine, or it's about, you know, working in an area that there are some I guess, complexities around Indigenous land ownership. I mean, we can talk about sovereignty until the cows come home, and we can talk about terra nullius. But the truth about it is, to get in and do that type of work is you've got to be open to those opportunities that you're provided to work with Aboriginal people as traditional owners. And I think it's about the same vice versa for our people is, you know, we don't know big flash language, and we don't, you know, we don't kind of speak in that academic way. And I have to remind myself when I go back to community, hey, come on, let's be real here. We're living in real times, real communities. No use talking about collaboration and integration and transformative practices. It's about doing the work while it's there. It's about being honest and open, and that goes both ways. I mean, Jock and I have certainly had difference of opinions through I guess, different disciplines. I'm a sociologist, training anthropologist, so it's definitely a different field, but I find it really interesting that you look at you know, in 1974, we had to fight to have anthropologists within my own school that were digging up our ancestors' remains for science. And I guess until those things were made, so that was in 1974, we had Aboriginal people saying, well, you know, you've got the world at your hands. You've got anthropologists coming from all over the country, but not, you got 2 Aboriginal people involved talking about the history of Australia, prehistory. So I think that for me is, and it was called the Eagle, Hawk and the Crow, which is pretty much covers my kinship, my moiety. So who my kinship group is, I'm a Waku woman, which means I'm a crow. But I also understand that some of the Kulin nations also have the story of Eagle, Hawk and the Crow. So it's very powerful, I think, if you can understand those rocks that are there, but you kind of don't understand what they're there for. And I think that's that process we walk together, black fellas and white fellas, and that's what it's all about. And all the colours in between, you know. Sorry I'm being so, you know, black and white about it all, but I also think it's about, you know, all those, wherever you come from, whatever race you belong to, if you want to work with black fellas, you know, I think it's about understanding and spending time, and goes both ways. But I think theoretically that we get caught up into where and what those practices should look like. Sometimes it's kind of not up to us to make those decisions if we're working and respecting the ontologies of Indigenous people. So I'm kind of talking too much now, and I'll go on a different tangent. So I'll let Jock do his little bit.
Thank you, Sophia. And I was, while you were speaking, I was wondering of a way that I could work in a reference to 2 of your favourite words, which are ontology and epistemology. And just to correct the misconception that you put out there that you never use big words, because that just ain't so. Look, thank you, and thank you for all 3 previous speakers. They were just beautiful words and presentations. Thank you, and thanks to you too, Sarah and Olivia, and all of your team. It's a privilege to be here, and it's just a really fantastic thing. And the way you framed the evening tonight, I think, has really had us talking about it, you know, today, which is great. So I'm sure this conversation will resonate throughout. I know I've started, but I would really like to start by acknowledging the Bunurong and the Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands I generate business and the business of making new knowledge. I acknowledge their ancestors, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the people of the Wathaurong and Wadawurrung nations of the Wadawurrung and Wathaurong people of the Kulin Nation, on whose lands, unceded still, I live and raise a family. And most particularly, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Barker, and there's been references to that all the way through with Ginny and Sophia, the Darling River, the Barkindji people, who have taught me just an inestimable amount inestimable amount about life itself. And that's wherein lies the transformation, I think. My bio starts with the statement that I'm a non-Indigenous landscape architect. And I started, and that's actually a very important acknowledgement to make also. In doing that, I would like to acknowledge all of the Aboriginal people in the digital room that we've created here, and thank them all particularly for sharing their journey. And my journey in this space started in 2013, and since then I've done lots of projects. I've taken studios to Wilcannia, I've taken studios to Murruwinchi, we've been to Broken Hill, we've been here on Culpra Station. That's developed into now into sets of research projects. And it's also been underpinned by my attempts to make meaning of it all through the vehicle of a PhD. So nearly 10 years now, and I hope my supervisor isn't listening, but and I don't know, probably 50 or 60,000 words, and really all that PhD boils down to is one moment where I realised, looking at my processes and methodologies and at that stage epistemologies, and looking back at projects which worked, as it were, which were successful, and projects which weren't successful, and trying to understand why that was so, and realising that I was issuing invitations to Aboriginal people to join projects which I thought would be of interest to them, and then me as a non-Indigenous person wondering why they didn't join my project. So after 50,000 words or so, I realised that actually that's the completely wrong way to do it, and that I am being issued an invitation on a daily basis to actually collaborate with Indigenous people, and the generosity of that invitation is such that we often overlook it. And I certainly had. So that the invitation exists whether we're on, as we are right now, Aboriginal owned land in a Western sense, and the statement of unceded land means that we are, as non-Indigenous people, involved in country. Wherever we are on country, and we have an obligation to have a relationship, a sovereign relationship, which is an act of the practice of reconciliation from a non-Indigenous perspective. And it's not a reaching out and coming in, but it's allowing oneself to be reached out to. And I think, Kim, that was they were two remarkable projects that you've shared with us. And I think inherently in there, I must say that both Sophia and I became quite tearful just in your description of it. They're incredibly powerful statements of almost anti-space, and within that there is a generosity which helps to hold that space and bring us in. We feel that invitation in, and part of that inherent to a non-Indigenous practitioner, inherent in that is what's quite famously been called staying with the trouble. So it is troubling to us, it must be troubling to us. We have to allow that trouble to settle. And
and that's when that transformative practice starts to begin to come about, I think, and it's something that sometimes, as an individual as made up of flesh, they're not always evident until you develop those relationships. I don't know, but we have this relationship now where it's like, I don't know about that. Is that fair income or what? So it's kind of breaking down, and I think it's about finding each person that works and wants to work in that space. And only individuals can do that for themselves. And I think if you're not opening up to those opportunities that come up to work with Indigenous communities, because we both have lots to share, and whether it's prehistory, you know, contemporary society, it's bringing two people together, whether you call it reconciliation, whether it's as a group. I think it's about our ways of working together as you know, as a settled colonised state. But amongst that settled colonised states comes a whole lot of issues around sovereignty. We've had our native title rights granted to be, you know, but at the end of the day, we have no sovereignty in terms of how we see the land being managed, how the water flows down the river. Those things are things that as Indigenous people, as First Nations people who've got their sovereign rights in the sense of the law, but there are all these complexities that come with that. And we ask you to come and walk that journey with us, because, you know, I think that to understand the way a westernised cultural colonised state works, who better to go to and work within a project? The mob who created those systems, well, not, you know, not individually, but in a Western world view, we've kind of, how do we adapt and modify what we do and make it worthwhile, not for us as individuals, but for the people we're providing a service for. And I think, you know, once you have those relationships, I think everything else opens to that. So in saying, where's the point of disruption? I think, you know, I'd put that back on you fellas and say, well, where do you think it's at? Because we certainly know where it is. And I'll shut up on that note, because I think it's important for Jock to finish as well.
No, I'm finished, but I think that's a great question to finish on. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sophia and Jock. And are we on mute? No. What you were saying, Sophia, really rings true for me. I grew up in the Grampians, and my father's based there, and he's a farmer and is in this, you know, struggling with these concepts himself to kind of how to make himself open to working with local Indigenous communities, and or as a, you know, the alternative, reaching out and kind of getting that right balance, because, you know, reaching out kind of expects this kind of return kind of equation, and I'm trying to work with him to be a little bit more open to the collaborations that might present themselves and not so much forcing those. So maybe we're going to move now into our second half of the event, where we open up the discussion panel to our audience, but also to our speakers, of course. We didn't give them much time to speak to one another before this event, so I'm sure they have questions of one another. A few practical things as we move into the discussion. We would love to see your faces, so keep your mics on mute for our whole audience, but we would love to see you turning on your video if that's possible with your internet, just so that we don't feel like we're looking at a black screen. We'll keep an eye on the chat and be picking out questions for everybody. And what we'll do is we'll say your name and ask you to unmute your mic, and you can ask that question yourself. To get the ball rolling, Liv's going to start us off with a question, and then perhaps the speakers might want to pose their own questions, and then we'll start opening it up to the floor. So over to you.
Cool. I think just to get the ball rolling, I wanted to ask the speakers to, if they could dream big as they wanted. Could you paint us a picture or a vision what it would look like to work in a decolonised Australia? What would it look like to work on sovereign land? And what would it mean? What would the process look like if Indigenous people were able to have sovereignty over their own land? Sophia, I think you touched on this really nicely before when you talked about Indigenous people having, I guess, the ability to decide what happens to the water, what happens to the land around the Murray-Darling Basin, and yeah, if you can continue on that point, yeah, what I think people get anxious when you talk about giving sovereignty to Indigenous people, but what does this look like, and why is this?
I've been waiting to be asked to dream big about this, because I think my whole relationship with my people is to come home and live on country, connect to my old people and be told, you know, what are their concerns about the values around having no water in the Barker. And I think it connected me back to place where I grew up. It's really, I guess, I get emotional when I talk about, I think, my people and the hardships that we've overcome as a tribe, you know, a clan of family groups. And we were kind of, I think, we've always maintained our cultural practices and the connection to our land, because nobody else would come and work at the back of Burke. Nobody would work in those environments. And I think that we were lucky in that sense of colonisation. Although we still lived on our land, we still lived on working with white man, and were able to maintain those practices. And by the time I was born, 50 years ago, my mother and father, they went living in a community where you still spoke your language. And I think that going back to those communities as an adult is the perfect example of our people. You know, we have our own structures within our own community. I might have come from that place, but at the end of the day, I'm also a visitor to those communities, and I have to be understanding of what those Indigenous protocols are, whether I'm a black fella, white fella, yellow fella, red fella, it don't matter. You got to still know what those protocols are to work in that particular community. And if there aren't any, you better find some, and find somebody that you are open to them leading you in engaging with community. And I think what the Barker, the evaluation of the Murray-Darling Basin Review did for me as an Indigenous woman was provide my people with an opportunity to have their voices about, you know, what's happening to our water system. It's not just water running through a river, it's our lifeblood. It's where our beginning, our dreaming stories all come from. And I think when we reported those issues back to the Department of Primary Industries, they were able to look at, for the first time in colonisation, what are our values as Barkindji people, as First Nations people? What do we value about not just the water in the river, but the lifeblood that it supports in billabongs, the underground water system? And my people were able to tell us that. And I think all First Nations people have their stories of place, whether you're in brick concrete buildings or whether you're in the bush like we are at the moment. Nothing evades the spirit of place and our memory of place. And I think that's the way of engaging on a level with Aboriginal people that values their ontologies and opens you up to those epistemological frameworks that, you know, we talk about, starting with the Nutchi story and about how the river was made. And I think those end results of videos, those music productions, they happen within school by our people. And it wasn't, you know, paid for by a big fancy project. It was about what our people wanted to do to share their knowledge of the river. And the way they did it was transformative through, obviously, in that case, dance and music. So surely we got some smart cookies in this world, you know, in this particular forum. And I think that's the opening of it, because you fellas are an expert. I'm the, you know, I look at my culture and my anthropological background, but at the end of the day, I'm sitting here in my country and, you know, getting ready to run away from all the spirits that are starting to move around on the wind.
Sophia, I'd like to take that question and kind of redirect it back to Kim. In that, did you find yourself having to reach out to local Indigenous people to be involved in your projects, or was that you found that process more of an opening up process and people came to you to work with you? Was it or a mixture of the both? I'd be really interested to hear how that's influenced your architecture in the last couple of years.
Pardon me. Yeah, I think a mixture of both. The War Memorial was came about from Daniel Boyd, who was a friend of mine for many years. He and a number of extraordinary artists, Ioane being one of them, Jonathan Jones, were invited to submit work for the Australian War Memorial as a sculpture commission. He reached out to us with the understanding that it should be more than a sculpture commission. It should be more than, you know, a bust on a plinth. That the significance of the first national Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal War Memorial needed more than that. It needed the presence that architecture can provide, I guess, and the space that it can manifest. So it was an invitation from him to us to work on that project together. And I guess through the process was working with the Ngunnawal Council of Elders and the Indigenous elders within the Australian Armed Forces, you know, and other and people like Tony Albert, who've been in that space before, and John Mundine, who've worked on war memorials. There's you know, and Fiona Foley, there's a history of people preparing these things, but there's still not so many. From In Absence, we'd been, you know, been fans of Ioane's work for a while and been hoping for an opportunity to work with her. And when the NGV commission came up a year and a half ago, we saw it as a platform, I guess, with the exposure it has. It's this is wonderfully, I don't know, within the Australian architecture scene, it's this elevated thing that we all look upon. And we saw that as that platform as an opportunity to center, you know, these stories that we're talking about tonight. Reach out to Ioane to have a conversation, to say, you know, to just start a conversation to see where it might go. And, you know, it quickly developed into something really interesting. And that conversation developed into the concepts that we kind of, you know, squeezed into the architectural form that is now. So both, I guess in one way it was you know, Dan reaching out to us, and it's the other way, us, you know, reaching out to Ioane and starting that conversation to initiate something, or to hopefully initiate something. Both of them were about dialogue. Both of them were about conversation. It was about building trust in that relationship, and then evolving a project from that point on. You know, is absolutely vital in terms of In Absence. We found that trust amongst ourselves to do that project together, to elevate these stories, but then immediately went out to, you know, Damien Bell, Vicky Cousins, Gunda Jamara, elders, to, I guess, to gain, you know, and Uncle Jim Berg at the Curie Heritage Trust in Victoria, to gain the, I guess, the consent to work with those stories. You know, the engineering scene in the eel traps down at Fudge Bim and the UNESCO heritage site down there, and the permanent houses and the agriculture. I mean, those things are stories we wanted to centre that are universal, that are across Australia, but we certainly elevated, I guess, the stories of the Gunda Jamara. It was incredibly important to go through them, through that process of conversation, making sure it was acceptable to use those stories within the work.
Okay, thanks very much, Kim. Our next question is going to come from Emily Elliott, who has written her question in the chat box.
I think about all the speakers, I was really wondering if there's a balance between telling the story of a site, place, and people, and designing for the future of architecture, and how do we fully respect and understand that process?
I might quickly start, and then I'll you know, let someone else jump in. I think yeah, I think there's a difference. I think the telling of a story of place, I guess, you know, yeah, truth telling, storytelling, knowledge sharing of place is incredibly important, and I think that comes before, you know, architecture design for that place. I think it's incredibly important for all of us as architects to understand and to know that it's incumbent upon us to understand the context of where we work and the stories there. It's up to us to reach out and to get that knowledge. And that informs, I think, the story of designing the architecture for those places. And then it's around stepping aside. There's an incredibly small amount of Indigenous architects practicing Victorian across Australia. It's about stepping aside and giving room to them, giving them oxygen in that space and support to come through, to have that self-determination to be the center of those stories, and to reach out and work together. I've probably taken up more time than I'd hoped. Sorry.
Would you like?
I could talk a little bit about that, if that's okay. I mean, I've worked in between architecture and landscape and for a while, and the thing that I guess I can see happening, which is quite different to some architectural practice, and sorry, Kim, I'm just speaking as a non-architect, is that once I used to see architectural projects as being, the site was being approached as kind of a tabula rasa. There was nothing there. And if there was something there, you should get rid of it because you would start anew. And I think that's really changing. And if it's not changing, then it should, because no site sites have got history. They've got geological history. They've got people there history. They've got all sorts of things. Even the construction of some of the new buildings or the buildings that are already there, whether you like them or not, they exist. And so I think one of the things that's kind of important is that before an architectural project is started, that enough time is spent finding out who and what there is about the project, from, as I said, geological time to human time. And I can see that that's shifting. I can see that there's a new concern for that. And I really also talk about with Kim that to work alongside Indigenous Aboriginal architects, to work and landscape architects and people who are not just in the design profession. I have the best time working alongside people who are not in design, and what you can kind of learn from working across a whole range of people. It's just great. So I can see there's a big shift, and I'm not sure if there's a perfect balance. And maybe a perfect balance means you won't get a great project. Maybe you have to have a tough balance, tough conversations, so that we can extend what we're doing.
Can I also, just along the same lines really, is that I'm an anthropologist. I have no idea. I don't pretend to know anything about architecture, or I can build a stick up and that sort of stuff, and a bit of a my.
That's not quite true.
But I guess what I'm saying is that from an anthropological point of view is that, you fellows are the experts in what your field of area is. And I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but I guess what I'm saying from a First Nations point of view, a woman who runs a consultancy group that connects and engages with Indigenous communities. So, just because we're black folks, we're not the expert on everything black, that we also have to consult with our processes of engaging with the right people for country. And the right people for country is no longer those people that we have personal relationships with. So we as Aboriginal people, whether we're an architect or an anthropologist, doesn't matter what your field of expertise is that maybe there's an alternative way of providing that bridging of engagement, and how do we do it, and fair income do it properly. It's not a one-off, it's not a 1 minute after the design has gone through and approved. It's got to be more than engaging with a few people that we knew, like in the old days, because now with native title, it's about following protocols and looking at how do we do this and fair dinkum give it a good go, because a one-off consultation is not engagement with our people. But anyway, that's I just found from an anthropological point of view, working in the field of that I work with as a part-time lecturer, as you know, is about providing that expertise from one, my personal lived experience as a Barkindji woman, and two, as an academic in the world of anthropology and sociology. And I also, you know, can share those things about what it means to live in an isolated community where the soil's still red and, you know, there isn't concrete buildings around us everywhere. How do we move forward to make our space in isolated communities just as inhabitable as those beautiful gardens and high-story gardens and coffee shops and all them flash and fancy things? How do we then modernise our isolated communities, which people just don't want to come to, but we love?
Well, not that all people don't want to come to. I think there's to bring all of that all three responses back, perhaps to add something through the original question about the you know, the big vision. And I think we get, as design professionals, we get to the big vision by understanding the way that our professions, both landscape architecture and architecture, are implicated in colonial processes and continue to be. And I suppose raises the question as to whether or not we are able yet to actually imagine, envision, kind of move beyond those colonial structures, processes, to imagine what it could be to be decolonised, and whether or not that is actually possible. And it's not to be defeatist and not say that we shouldn't try. I mean, that's what drives us. But I think I agree with Ginny in this sort of where we're understanding a turning point where site is no longer tabula rasa, that we do understand, and I think that's exemplified by the projects that we've seen, and what Sophia was just sort of coming back to in terms of our kind of cross disciplinary engagements, which allow those stories to be told and to come to the fore in ways that are truthful, and that are being told truthfully. And you know, our mediums really, as a landscape architect, I'm more and more aware that the very concept of landscape is something that we actually need to be, you know, very mindful of actually transcending and moving beyond. And I think the same for architecture, in that our understanding our own role as practitioners within these milieu and contexts is actually, we can choose to be adding or not to an underlying issue. So the concept of landscape is a colonial concept. It's a very colonial concept, and at its heart has been this idea of site, and that, you know, we can do whatever we want with it. And architecture's been a little bit the same, and that is shifting. And I think that we need to continue that shift. It's an individual shift that's required. It's the transformation that I think we've all talked about. But it's also a disciplinary shift that's required. And it's hard work. It's tough work. And I think that question, the audience question, was fantastic, because there really is no perfect balance. It's a I think Kim used the term a conversation, and it is a conversation. And within that conversation, there's a negotiation of positions, and within that,
and that's the key word, is that negotiation. So those discussions and negotiations can only lead to, you know, better in the way that we work together, whether it's finding a balance or looking at how we can see the world in two different worlds, but come across and you know, sharing the space and creating that something new with something that I find is really exciting area that you fellows work in, and have that opportunity. And you know, I think that's a good question about how do we find that balance without conflict. Without conflict, you know, you're kind of wondering if you can't be that perfect. So it kind of is about, you know, balancing your balance of information and what's you know, and it's a conversation about it and negotiation about what the end outcome is.
And sitting down and having a yarn is a lot different to sending an email or sending a text message. And, you know.
Yarning is the key. I like a yarn.
Sophia wrote a master's thesis on yarning as a methodology, and I can recommend anyone to read it.
So I try to formalise this practice of yarning, so it's not just making up a story. It actually had validity in research practices around qualitative research for Indigenous people. So don't feel bad just sitting around having a coffee. That's validated research.
One of my other questions is, I think Jeannie, you almost touched on this before, but I want to know, as architects, whenever we design something, we're taught to celebrate whatever is going to be new, whatever is going to be put in the new spot, and we're told that it'll be great. Do you think we should have space in our process for mourning the land that we're destroying by that process? Do you think the reason we don't do that is because if we sat and thought about what came before, it would be too hard to continue in the way we continue now? Do you think our process is correct the way it is? How do you think we need to change the process that we have currently?
That's a
That's a hard one.
I mean, it's personal, isn't it? And so it's I'm not sure to what extent it's, and I understand where you're coming from with process. I'm not sure that it is processual. I think there's an act of recognition which is becoming more embedded in our practice, through which it becomes a personal obligation to understand that we must do that. And I'm of a generation that I'm just overjoyed to see the younger generation coming through and pushing us in that direction, us older people who are kind of on the way out, you know. Like we you know, it's game over for us. We're done. And it's just wonderful to see that this shift is happening. And I'll let others speak about the idea of process, but to me, that it's about practice actually, and it's an everyday practice of that relationship.
Can I also say that I don't think you should be lacking confidence in the fact that you know how to do things. Whenever I've worked with people, and it has been about this idea of the conversation, it usually comes about by spending enough time to work things through and talk about different ways of doing it. I think one of the things is to have enough time to say, what if we did it like this? What if we did it like that? And to have that conversation around the work. And people who know me will have heard me say this before, but I'll say it again. The thing that I learned by working up in the APY lands in Mimili was that we were having consultation with the ladies, and so we were asking what they want. And I can remember one lady, she'd seen enough of us consultants, and she said, look, I want to know what you think. You show me what you think, and then I can tell you what to do with it. So don't come and just tell me, because you're the person, you're coming here with your knowledge. So you show us what you know, and then we'll show you what we know. And it was fantastic, because I just thought she was just saying, look, sick of you lot. I want to know, if you're here to do a job, do that, and then we can tell you about it. And it wasn't a sense that we were there to present, here, this is what we've got for you. It was more like, had you thought about this? And then we can have a conversation about it. We could only converse around the work. And it was just fantastic. And I don't know what Sophia and Jock and Kim think about that, but I learned a big lesson that day.
Yeah. And I think what that story underlines, Ginny, is that conversation can only happen through that relationship. And so the relationship that you have there is one where you can be told that and accept that what way to be. So in a sense, you've kind of so, you know, that's the process, I guess, but it is being open to that and to the relationship, which I think is fantastic. Sorry.
We're going to go to Joseph's question next. Joseph, are you able to unmic and be out?
Yes, hello. Thank you to all the speakers and hosts. My question is in relation to the distinction between landscape architecture and how that, I think Jock and Sophia addressed this, how that negotiation plays out in projects that you see to be either successful or unsuccessful. I think obviously landscape architects are more familiar with dealing with time that is, you know, much longer than say the last 200 years, and architects aren't so used to that. But I'm just interested to hear from either the landscape architects or architects in the room how they, or others, or anthropologists, what their experience of that feels like.
Can I be so bold as to throw this one over to Kim? Because I think your practice, no, I won't even prefigure. I reckon that it'd be great to hear your take on that, Kim.
I don't know. Our position is there's a difference between architecture and place. There's a difference between architecture and landscape. And the way we often think about it is I guess there are narratives within place. And those narratives belong to the, I don't know, the personal and cultural histories that we carry with us, each of us universally, individually, and how we share those, or they're shared with us based on our knowledge and understanding of that place. Architecture is this thing that comes in and kind of sits in the middle of that and can act as a block to that, or as a facilitator to that, or as a, you know, some kind of mediary, as an interface to those cultural systems that can bring light to those, that can kind of help to show from a, you know, for example, it can help from people from a non-Indigenous perspective to get an understanding of what's there. It can kind of act as a fulcrum to crack open that missing knowledge, or that gap in knowledge. It can also act as an interface to allow us to see place in terms of, you know, the ecosystem, you know, the temporality of that place in a different way. I mean, I know this might sound abstract, but that's kind of how we see the distinction of the landscape or place and architecture. That, you know, the architecture kind of exists in a place for a period of time, you know, and most houses we design sit there for about 100 years. That's a blip. That's an absolute blip in the time scale of the geological time scale of, you know, the earth, the country that we sit upon. When you think about the crack of Australia from Gondwanaland and the evidence of that you can see down Lorne, I guess down the Great Ocean Road. So there's a temporality to our architecture that it's an inhabitant like we are, but it's a way of communicating stories and sharing those. I think I just went on a total ramble, but I hope
that from logical view, that's great. Understanding it from an Indigenous archaeological architectural point of view, like that's too many architects and anthropologies and all those sort of big flash names, I think. But I love what you said, Kim. That's virtually what we're looking at in terms of temporality. And, you know, once upon a time this place was a great basin for hosting 320,000 population in the Riverine Murray area, and I think that's that temporality of colonisation and living in a colonised state. And I'm glad to hear another black fella say it.
I was actually just wondering, can I just respond to Kim's quickly? One of the things that struck me, Kim, when I was looking at your wonderful project in Canberra, the memorial, and the sequence of the way that you unfolded it, it sort of dawned on me that there's beginning to be a whole network of Aboriginal projects that reflect upon each other, or that you can draw links to. And one of the places that whenever I go to Canberra, I always go to is what I call the Garden of Eden, which other people know, we've talked about it before, which is this painting of a garden on the pavement at the Aboriginal Embassy. And those elements that you have in your work are the elements that people put into that place that have been there for years and years and years. And it's to me, it's one of the most powerful places that I've ever been to. And I can start to see some of those ideas that are really important to share are in your project. And I'm starting to think of other projects where some of these same elements are done differently, but they seem to be kind of foundational elements that might actually be about communicating ways of understanding country or talking about country and life. And that's just something that I really saw in your work, and I really appreciate it, to start to think about how we have projects that are connected. They're not all just standalone. They might be done by different people from completely different ways of thinking, but you can see there's a thread and a way of connecting these projects around Australia. And I think things might, if you talk about big ideas, things that might be where you just, wherever you move around Australia, you see these projects that have these kinds of thinking behind them, and that you can sometimes recognise a similar kind of element, but you know that they are drawn from working with people. And I'm just interested to maybe start to map out where they are, because I think your project and the Canberra project I go to are really very interconnected in some way.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Thank you, Ginny. I think that that idea of this kind of, you know, this thread of these kind of joined components of projects that, I don't know, unpack or open access to these stories is really important. What I'm really conscious of is that there are a finite amount of them. I guess, again, talking within an architectural context in terms of, I don't know, memorials or monuments or buildings that speak of these stories and that join together to create this tapestry. It's a small tapestry relative compared to, you know, the absolute carpet that covers everything else. And what I hope you know, may happen in the near future is that those tapestries, I guess, interweave, and so there's not kind of a small point of interconnected dots kind of telling these stories and communicating and cross-referencing one another. In terms of sharing Indigenous knowledge, those are thread 100%, like, absolutely homogeneously throughout, I guess, our built environment. So we don't have to go seeking for them. They're just there, and there's that normalization in terms of exposure to indigeneity. So it's not this, from a non-Indigenous perspective, it's not this kind of other thing over there. It's intrinsically something that's part of our culture and part of our knowledge. And when that happens, I can only imagine it's almost impossible for systematic kind of injustices to continually to perpetuate, because we're so cognizant of what they mean and what they represent. It's kind of, I guess, the erasure of that memory, or the erasure of those stories, that allows those injustices and those, you know, the system that enables them to keep going, because there's so much ignorance, because there's a lack of exposure to these stories. I guess what I hope is, in having these conversations in a public manner like this, is that you know, it shows how much more there is to, I guess, to share and to spread around there. But hopefully there are many more projects like that.
And in a way, I think, Kim, what that offers in a bigger context is that it offers the opportunity for Australia to be a very different place. And I think that what Ginny's identified in that relationship between those two projects, inherent in that is an understanding of the possibility of place as a vehicle or an agent of change, and yet so much place making, as we understand it, which is neither landscape architecture nor architecture, it becomes co-opted back into a kind of neoliberal system of sameness. It becomes almost a marketing tool. And so I think, in a way, what what happens, or what needs to happen, is an allowance or a kind of facilitation for these relationships to take place, and so that starts to create, there's almost an intangibility to this, and an inevitability in that intangibility to creation of a place. I'm often reminded of one of the last couple of lines in Bill Gamage's book, The Greatest Estate, where he talks about the need for us to engage in this way in order to understand our place in Australia. We take it for granted that we know what this country means, what it's all about, but we've got work to do.
There's a lot of work to do.
Telling, I think, Mark, I think it's about the truth telling, Kim, and sometimes that can be those difficult conversations, but they've got to be had. And I think that sometimes if you're opening that forum up for those discussions, and certainly by the work you've done, the work that Jock and I've been doing, and I'm sure there's other people other than just us. So I think it is about that acknowledgement and moving towards Australia that's reconciled, but an Australia that recognises that our sovereignties, as individual communities, like I'm Barkindji Barinji, Barkindji people get native title, but we're still fighting for our individual sovereign rights as to live our way we want to live, and which may be different to the people on the Mill or Mallee people, like when rivers join, so those junctions. And I think that's those opportunities to kind of have those discussions that you normally wouldn't have.
We have another question. This has kind of come from our archives that we've collected coming up to the event, but it also takes on from what you were saying there, Sophia, about truth-telling. And it's the truth-telling around statues in Australia and across the world, and how they are kind of furthering a certain history and agenda, because they exist in both the very, in landscape and in architecture, and have a relationship to both of those areas. And since we have both architects and landscape here, it seems only fitting that we ask you about statues and how we might design them better, or protest with them in mind, or
Get rid of them.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on statues and what role they play
I find them quite fascinating. To live in the bush, I've never been to Melbourne, and it's kind of, when I originally went to Melbourne, and it was quite scary, these big fellas on these big horses, and what are they all about? Who's this fella anyway? So I think a very hegemonic process has occurred to allow these figureheads to portray an image in our mind as a state, a nationhood, and therefore it leaves out and adds to the othering. I wrote a paper about Aussie kids and the Weet-Bix ad. You know that in 1985 they had no Aboriginal kids on the Weet-Bix ad? And it was about nationhood and sovereignty, about where do Aboriginal people fit in this perception of nationhood? Are we always going to be the downtrodden? Because, I think that's about that truth-telling and the way we work in memorising massacre sites. I'm 500 kilometres from Mount Dispersion massacre site.
500 metres.
Well, 500 metres, give or take a few river miles, And it's kind of something that you're aware of, but you've got a stone cairn there saying that this is where Mitchell had his first encounter with Aboriginal people. We know for a fact that he slaughtered them. And I think that's the other side, truth-telling side to the prehistory. And the Historical Society can have their stone cairn if they want. But I think on the other side to that is, where are our stories? Where is the story of the mother with the kid on the back that got shot in the onslaught? Where are the generations of families that have survived those massacres? They're still around today. but yet where is there recognition that those sites happen apart from a stone carve? How do we celebrate life and spirit within those places when it's full of spirits of our ancestors, both on my father's side and my mother's? And I think it's about, well, finding the right people that actually connect you to those places is something that we should be trying to do, not just as anthropologists, but as a team of people working together. And that's what I think partnership's about. And that's the relationship that I have with RMIT and Jock as a landscape architecture. So I think it's about opening up for, we certainly had issues where, you know, no, I mean, I think it's that fine line of saying, well, that's a white fella story, this is the black fella story. How do we find that perfect middle and accepting that, yeah, okay, that's happened, but how do we move forward from that? And that may take weeks, it may take months. And I think it's that commitment then to the process that you're involved in. But yeah.
I'm just going to add, Sophia, on talking about massacre sites across Australia. Everyone in the audience, if they haven't already, I'd recommend go to the Guardian. There's a resource put together by the Guardian called "The Killing Times." On it's a map, and I guess an active map put together with the University of Newcastle Colonial Frontier Massacres project team that tries to give historical, I guess, background to every single massacre site across Australia, and there are so many. But it's one of the stories that are still untold, and it's one of the stories that there are so many people on these big bronze horses on these plinths in parks across Australia who are the perpetrators of those massacres, and that alternate story isn't being told. I mean, it's despicable that I guess Indigenous community need to go to Hyde Park and picnic in this kind of public grounds, this public commons, and have Captain Cook kind of standing over them without the sensitivity of understanding what that represents. And that's a microcosm of every single public park around Australia that could be repeated like that. That has this presence of threat, or this history of threat in those public commons. I mean, that's at the moment the memorial. I guess what memorials represent in Australia is so profoundly skewed to one history, and eliminating the pain and trauma and of memory of Indigenous history that are totally enmeshed, as you're saying, Sophia, in those same stories. But we only get told one side of them, and a very cleansed side of those stories. Also, I mean, it's also disappointing in the Australian context that, in terms of the recent protests around racial injustice and police and Aboriginal deaths in custody, that very, very quickly got turned around to a conversation around the culture wars and a very, there's a very important conversation to be had about memorials, but it displaced conversations around absolutely present issues, here and now within our incarceration system that got sidelined.
Yeah, I'm kind of conflicted by this because, and I think it's building upon the idea that we should actually know the proper stories. And if we remove every statue, which I would be supportive of, but if we do, does that mean that we don't have the ability to, at that statue or at that place, tell the story that should be told? Are we just expunging that from history? So I don't know. I haven't got an answer. I would love. When I saw the Captain Cook statue with red all over it, that really was important. I thought, okay, we're having a conversation here. We're actually saying this is the story that should be told, reminding people that that's the case. So, as I said, I'm conflicted by it because I don't know the best way of being able to tell some of the stories. And I've seen that there's the massacre site at Lake Victoria, and there's all those the stories being told there, and there are different forms of it. just before we started, I saw that in America, they had painted in San Francisco Black Lives Matter on the ground. And immediately they had finished that, some people came along with black paint and started to paint out the sign, which I found really shocking because so it became a protest over a protest site. So I don't know what you do about that. So I'm sorry, I'm just sharing that. I'm conflicted by it because how do you equally tell the story, the bad story, as well as trying to start conversations where people will understand what the true stories are? I don't know.
That's a super interesting point, and that kind of leads into my next question, which I'm going to combine with or ask two questions in a row. One's going to be from me, and then another one's from Mattia, who will introduce themselves after I finish. I want to know, should we be designing prisons? Should we be refusing them as a program on principle? Should we be designing police stations? As you talked about with statues, when we often white people see these statues in a totally different way to how Aboriginal people see these places, and I'm sure that's the same with prisons. White people's vision of a prison compared to Indigenous people, and when I see a police station, I probably feel a completely different way to an Indigenous person. How do we deal with those spaces? And then Mattia, did you want to ask yours at the same time? Just to
Hi everyone, and thank you so much. It's a very interesting discussion. I was just wondering, like, Western placemaking is often building and creating something other within the natural space, whether this is by acknowledging the context or not. I was wondering whether Aboriginal cultures define place of the natural space mainly through storytelling, and if so, what are the strategies that can endorse such placemaking in design and architecture beyond, of course, collaboration and communication?
Thanks, Mattia. Who would like to start with one of those two questions?
Can I think back to what was your question about building?
Should we design prisons? Should we?
Honey, no disrespect. Let's get away from prisons and let's start building wellbeing centres. Let's start looking at how do we solve the issues that have led up to the atrocities and the social emotional well-beings of our people that have gone through transgenerations of the next generation. How about we break this societal thing about a penal system colony in Australia and start really looking at how do we support and work with communities about drug and alcohol, substance abuse, family violence, whatever those issues are. It's what's this big thing about white society who want to lock people up all the time? Isn't it about well-being and social emotional improvements in the way we move forward as a society? And I think the crux of it is that we shouldn't be looking at, you know, the penal system as a way of improving Indigenous people, considering that we have really high retention rates in prisons, both from women's prisons as well as men. We've got a lot of young women in prison who should be out looking after their babies. We've got, you know, other alternative ways of isolating and treating those behaviours associated with why they're in jail in the first place. And then back to our matey's question. Sorry, I can't remember your name.
Mattia.
Mattia, how are you? I think
Good.
You're pretty much spot on in what you're saying about place and creating something from that, whether it's from the story of place or the place can have two contexts to me. Is one of dreaming stories, which tells us it's kind of like, you know, the Bible about JW. Well, our God is the dreaming serpent, and Kulawaru, we call him in Barkindji. So we have a whole new dreaming system that that we want to share with people. And that's about those types of dreaming stories. So other stories are about what happened in certain places, like the massacres. So there's context to both of those things that you're asking about. And I think once you get out there and you're exploring those contexts, then you'll know whether it's a spiritual or it's a social spiritual, or it's just about improving society and how we come together as black people, white people, or whether you're, you know, black, white and brindle is what my favourite saying is. We come in all colours and sizes, but so does the rest of Australia. So I think working with Indigenous people is about accepting our differences as Australians and how we work together and improve this nation for my babies. That's the beautiful thing, is that my kids will grow up knowing the dreaming stories. They won't have to tell their friends because they'll already know them. Everyone will know about Nutchi building, making the river. If you work and live in this area, you will know those dreaming stories. That to me is the perfect world. In Australia that we share. My kids don't have to explain their culture or where they're coming from because you fellas will already know it.
Sophia, just applauding your response to both questions, particularly the first in terms of designing prisons. You know, absolutely spot on response. You know, there are so many conversations at the moment about defunding the police, and I guess the backbone of that conversation is of redirecting the funds into this perpetual incarceration system, to redirecting those funds to the systems that will support those, you know, the underlying social inequalities and the social problems that lead to this unjust incarceration system. You know, absolutely what we should collectively be working towards.
Yeah, I agree too with both of those. I mean, I just think it's our responsibility as designers, architects, landscape architects, to be pretty clear about who the people are who are giving us the brief for these things. And what are the underlying structures that support the fact that prisons and police stations aren't the places of well-being that they could be. I think too often sometimes we accept what the brief is, or we say, yes, this is what the job is. Whereas, and we don't take responsibility for being able to change some of those ideas by bringing other people into it and improving whatever the brief is. So wouldn't it be amazing to be able to change what was a prison into a wellbeing centre? But that's only going to happen if we actually do enough work to know what it should be, what should be the basis of work.
You redefine the brief and say this is the only circumstances we can work under. And I think something about truth telling to those powers that be that, you know, brief us on the projects. And no, I can't do that because it's probably going to take 12 more months and you've only given me 3.
That was a part of with the War Memorial that we did with Dan. The brief from the client, the Australian War Memorial, was to provide a memorial for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander servicemen, men and women of the Australian Armed Forces. And we, without communicating it to the client, we designed the project so that it went beyond that, because that brief that we were given by the client and asked to design for wasn't sufficient for what the significance of that project was. It absolutely needed to be wider than that and to encompass fighting for country and sacrificing for country universally, not just within the Australian Armed Forces. So having that responsibility or that ethics as an architect to question and challenge and expand briefs that you're given is really, really important. Also, in terms of I think your question, Mattia, around Indigenous placemaking, I certainly will not talk. I can't answer that question as a non-Indigenous architect, but Jifa Greenway, who has had a Dolly Dixer question here that we've been needing to get to for some time. An example of one of his projects was working with Melbourne University, was articulating or using design to highlight systems that are in place that we're all invisible to. I guess those of us in Melbourne, a project he worked on was using ponds and bodies of water within Melbourne University and connecting those to waterways, specifically waterways that are running down Elizabeth Street, kind of waterways that are trenched and underground and literally invisible within the city of Melbourne, but are still migrationary pathways for the eels of Melbourne. And so part of his design process or outcome was connecting those waterways and those eel migrations to ponds within the University of Melbourne grounds, so that those eels would actually come into those bodies, and in times of migration and eel spawning, you could quite literally see them and see the connection to waterways and country that was quite literally built over. And I think that's a beautiful level of placemaking, from a fantastic Indigenous architect. And his question from earlier that I don't think we've answered properly is, how do you collaborate with Indigenous people? Totally go to the Indigenous Design Charter, the Australian Indigenous Design Charter, and the International Indigenous Design Charter. For everyone here who's an architect and interested in this space, get familiar with these fantastic documents that create protocols for how to do this. Obviously, just conversation and yarning is one way to do it, but there's some fantastic framework in those documents.
I think that's a great acknowledgement, Kim, and I think that it is a wonderful set of documents, and
we certainly guides our work that we do as collaborative partners. And there's another overlay then of conversation that they generate, I think. And so the great thing about those protocols is that they allow conversations on multiple levels. So between collaborators, between what might be seen sometimes as collaborators and those community members, I guess, but they provide a mechanism through which those artificial boundaries kind of dissolve, really, and allow the establishment of right relationships. So that was a great question. Thank you, Mattia. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your answers. Thank you.
I'm quite interested in trying to work out what might be a useful project. Like, from the first beginning, if an idea comes to you, or somebody comes to you with a need or something, what might be useful? And it sounds pretty simple, but I've been working with wonderful woman Ines Marsh, who's an Adnyamatna elder, and we're looking at kind of just useful everyday projects that might be useful for Adnyamatna people here in this place. And they can be quite small. Like, we've got a seed bomb project where we're making seed bombs so we can go and throw them out into the landscape, which is full of drought. And that's one project. And so they can be tiny. And some of those tiny projects can maybe go much further. So I think there's different scales of things that we can do. And I'm wondering if we can look at, a series of useful projects that might start small and become bigger, or how we might look at what the different range and variety of useful things might be. Anyway.
I think Ginny, that's a great example, because that's seems like a small project, but right from its inception, you're even describing it at a huge scale. So all it's doing is planting a seed, but that is, through scales of time and space, really, and I think that's where that's got a sense of utility comes in, and where it meshes. So I think, I know that you're pushing us to get, down to tin tacks and say, what are the projects? But in a sense, to remain a little bit abstract and say a project which does that, I think is a useful project. It's a kind of really interesting, useful way of reflecting upon the usefulness of a project. And I think we certainly find that working, and particularly working with Sophia's dad, the the concept of usefulness, I think, is a really interesting one, and it seems to me as though that ability for a project to bring space and time together, or to understand the relationship between the two through those scales, is really what underpins what we conceive to be useful.
Well, I'm going to draw the camera back to us. We're very nearly at 8:30, and being new to Zoom, I have a feeling that we're going to be cut out at 8:30 because we haven't made the booking for any longer. I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers for coming and joining us online tonight. Liv for all of her hard work, and again, Loot Bar. They've really done so much for us tonight. It's been fantastic. Our next event is going to be next month, and we're hoping to draw on a lot of what we've touched on this month into next event next month. So to wrap up, we thought, because we're not sure whether or not it's going to finish, we might open up to Ellie to ask her final question of the speakers, and we will just play a game of fire where whoever gets in before the time is up. So Ellie, would you like to turn on your microphone and ask your last question, and we'll all be on the edges of our seats.
Oh, hi, sorry, I'm here.
Okay. Hi, Ellen.
I was just wanting to know, I've just finished reading Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, and I was looking into sort of the architecture of the First Nations people and how they did live. So I was just wondering what some examples of traditional Aboriginal architecture would be, and how we could possibly integrate them, or elements or principles of those into sort of modern day architecture or landscape or place projects.
A series of roundhouses. No corners so the spirits don't get us.
I think one example that would be certainly within the that book, Dark Emu, is and that we spoke about before, is the houses, or the stone houses at the Budj Bin heritage site in Lake Condah in Western Victoria, which are were the permanent homes of Gunda Jamara people there. That certainly want to see. There are a number of across many different communities, different styles, depending, of course, the amount of Indigenous nations is huge, and the amount of different architectures is also huge, and the different ways of using architecture, both permanent and temporal, to connect to country is vastly different. So there are so many different answers to that question. How to incorporate that knowledge into architecture, I think that's a really interesting one in terms of, I don't know, was there a question floating around earlier around appropriation, and how do we do that? How do we use those things and incorporate them? Do we have the consent to? Are we working with the custodians of that language? We certainly need to be, if we're working with those languages and trying to incorporate them into contemporary architecture. All of those questions need to be asked. I think this is what I think was coming up before, Jock and Sophia, about initiating conversation and making sure we sit within the what was the term? Stay within the trouble. If there's a challenge there, stay within it, come to understand it, and move beyond it. But move through it with mutual respect and discourse, to understand that yes, there are these histories there and there's architectural languages there, but if we want to use them, how do we use that respectfully and appropriately?
Could I also talk a little bit about, it's not particularly traditional, but I've been really fortunate to spend some time with my friends when making a new homeland. And in the making of the new homeland from scratch, they've actually set out the most absolutely, somebody said perfect before, set of relationships between living, sleeping, fire, and everything. And it's all made out of bits and pieces that we can find anywhere, or that somebody donates, or somebody comes along. This is in the Flinders Ranges, And every time I go to this place, I just think it's fantastic. And so I think we can look from traditional responses, but it's a bit like what Sophie is saying, who said build us a roundhouse. These guys are building places to live in that actually work for them across all ages. So elders, little ones, and each particular space is absolutely built to purpose. So let's look for tradition, but actually look at how really wise building and spatial design and making a place, and this is actually place making, everybody's doing it now.
Well, thank you everyone. Again, it looks like we have been given just a little bit more time, but we might wrap it up there. Again, thank you Jock Gilbert, Sophia Pearson, Kim Bridgeland and Ginny Lee for joining us. It has been an absolute pleasure. I know I speak for myself, but hopefully Liv as well, in that we're really looking forward to taking everything that you've brought to us and to our audience tonight into our next event next month. So yeah. Thank you and good night.